to take a crack at that argument. Here we go.
Thank you. Charles McGuire, and I've just enjoyed all the classes that I take here.
Good to have you here, Charles.
Basically, you know, one of the things that you said is within foreign policy that the Republicans and the Democrats, for the most part, seem to be on the same wavelength. But what I'm hearing now, where there seems to be a lot of controversy over the Israeli situation, what's going on there. Do you have any comments on that as far as do you see that as a real conflict, or a conflict that's going to continue, that's brewing and may become a polarizing issue?
Well, in terms of domestic politics, which, you know, we're always making that point, it actually confirms what I was saying much more than almost any other example, because it's really a situation where the two parties are, in a sense, engaged in an auction as to who's going to offer Israel more. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been extremely effective in appealing to Congress. Essentially, if he doesn't like what he hears from Obama, and generally he likes most of what he hears, but if there's anything at all he doesn't like from Obama, he simply goes to Congress. And the Republicans these days in Congress give him an even warmer, they were standing much more. That was interesting. You know how during the State of the Union address, people stand and clap? It's something that drives me absolutely crazy. Even if I could ever get elected to Congress, it's the reason I never serve. I don't like jumping up and down. But obviously, if you're going to be a congressman, you got to be really good at jumping up and down. And so they did this for Netanyahu, a foreign leader, which is very odd. And it was really the Republicans that were jumping up more than the Democrats. And then you got this by-election in New York where Anthony Weiner, of the infamous photo scandal, was persuaded by the Democrats not to seek re-election. When Republicans get involved in a sex scandal, the party generally rallies behind them to keep the seat, but not the Democrats. They dumped the guy probably thinking that anybody elected from that part of New York would be a Democrat, and lo and behold, a Republican got elected to that seat. Anthony Weiner was known as the single biggest supporter of AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, in Congress, and yet he got out AIPAC by the Republican candidate whose position on Israel was even more pro-Israel. So both parties, they compete with each other. Now, what will be the impact of that in the world as a whole? If you believe, as I do, that at some point there will have to come into existence a Palestinian state, and that state actually is going to have a little bit of territory, and that the settlers in Israel, who are sort of taking one piece of Palestinian territory after another, have to be stopped in order for that to happen. Then this is not good for a Middle East peace settlement. It's not good at all. But in terms of the framework, you couldn't find a clearer example of where there's hardly a shade of difference between the parties than Israel.
Over here.
Julia Geisen is my name. You mentioned that we have very deep polarization. And I'm wondering, what will it take as far as domestic policy goes? Is there any hope, or are we going to continue to spiral downward?
Yeah. It's a good question. Is there any hope? Well, you know, it used to be the case that when you had two polarized parties, all the pundits, the sort of Tom Friedmans of the world, and there are a whole list of sort of pundits like that, would say, what we really need is a moderate centrist party in between them. And Friedman wrote a column last week saying that, and it was quickly pointed out by just about every blogger and journalist with any credibility that we actually have a centrist party right in the middle. It's called the Democratic Party. I don't know what more you can do to find that sort of elusive center that everyone seems to talk about. I don't see an end to the polarization, I'm afraid. And I have an uneasy feeling that we are, God, I really shouldn't say this, but I have to say, I have an uneasy feeling that we are rapidly approaching complete ungovernability in this country. And I think the test case will be the next Supreme Court justice. I think that when there's a retirement or a death on the court, and if it's a Democratic president who gets to make that appointment, I personally do not believe that the Republican Party will allow any appointment to happen. Any Democrat. I just don't see how. Given that you need 60 votes, and given that there will be, well, we don't know whether the Republicans will be a majority in the Senate after the next election. We certainly know that there'll be more than 40, which is all it takes to block a vote. I'm really worried about that one. I think that we essentially have a situation where maybe not John Boehner, who actually looks like an old kind of classic Paul in all of this. So I would exempt Boehner, and I might even exempt Mitch McConnell, who also the Republican leader who has kind of that. But I think there's a significant element within the Republican Party that simply does not believe that the Democratic Party is a legitimate political party. It will not accept that its policies are the result of a loyal opposition that the Republicans may disagree with, but just as the Republicans have every right to get their candidates elected and to try to pass laws based upon the mandate that the electoral process has created, some significant portion of the Republican Party does not accept that fact. It is, I have to tell you, the most dangerous trend I've ever witnessed in my life as an observer of American politics. I have never seen the country on this kind of precipice before. And I am deeply, deeply, deeply worried because I don't see any way out, except one, and that is maybe Americans will start actually paying attention to politics, but Americans don't seem to want to do that either. And so, yeah, I wish you hadn't asked me.
And when you say ungovernable, what does that mean?
Well, at the moment,
Are we gonna have
it
some
used to
more?
be, in the old days, you said, oh, let's judge the political system by the laws that get passed. These days, it's let's judge the political system as to whether or not they can avoid shutting down. There's nothing being passed. The problems in this country are enormous. They haven't gone away. I mean, people may not like government, but you still sort of need bridges and airports and all these things. I mean, there's just nothing going on here. I guess you could say that, well, it could be resolved by a clean sweep one way or the other. But the real weirdness in American politics is that we've had one clean sweep after another, and the minute a party gets a kind of big mandate, 2 years later, Americans are turning to the other party. So if the Republicans do very well in 2012, given what they advocate, which are actually highly unpopular programs, and if they actually try to do what they say, it'll be a couple of years and people, oh, I didn't know they wanted to do that. Like, duh, where have you been? All these years, and then they'll turn around the other way. So that's great. As I said, at the end, I like to be optimistic. But you asked a question that brought out the pessimist in me.
Thank you.
I'm trying to steal some.
Who are you?
Randy Garten, and I'm trying to steal some of what a previous speaker has said and apply it to what you're talking about. In domestic policy, and especially in economics, regulation, and the government support of how much help the government should give people, there seems to be a pretty clear continuum and a consistent philosophy that you can place somewhere on that continuum. But in foreign policy, it doesn't seem like there is, I think that's one of the reasons why there's perhaps why there is not so much differentiation, and you have individual people oppose a particular action, but it's not, there's no coherent philosophy that's guiding either party. So I wonder if you could comment on that, and do you have a coherent kind of framework that might apply to American foreign policy?
That's a good point. I think you're probably right that there is a kind of remarkable lack of coherence. when it comes to foreign policy issues. I mean, you could say that, you know, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the protests against that, there did emerge some relatively coherent perspectives, you know, with one saying that we were overextended there and we should be more selective in how we deploy our force, and another saying, no, we sort of had to constantly be aware of threats. But a lot of that is broken down. And there is a kind of I think, you know, I think again, I said in my talk, I tried to follow as carefully as I could what I thought was one of the most crucial decisions of the Obama presidency, and that was the Afghani situation, because first of all, Bob Woodward wrote about it, so you had a book with all this sort of inside gossip, but you know, what were we going to do there? And according to Woodward's book, which I have every reason to believe is probably relatively accurate, you had one group sort of generally associated with Vice President Biden who were advocating what could be called a counterterrorism strategy. And you had another group associated with General Petraeus and General Stanley McChrystal advocating what could be called a counterinsurgency policy. And the idea of the counterinsurgency policy, which goes back to Petraeus and the doctoral dissertation he wrote at Princeton, is that terrorism is bred by instability. And so you have to create a stable political system. You have to literally create a stable state. And once you create a stable state, then terrorism will decline. Whereas the Biden position was, we can't create stable states in unstable situations. We should have a counterterrorism policy, which just simply aims to stop terrorism and doesn't worry about state building. It'd be nice if we could build the states, you know, but it's kind of beyond our power. And so there were two very articulate, well-formed by General Petraeus is a brilliant intellectual. Joe Biden is a very thoughtful and experienced foreign policy person, and they both presented their ideas, and Obama sort of split the difference between them, almost like, you know, you do in domestic politics. Maybe that's what a president, maybe that, you know, that's kind of what he had to do. But I was struck, I mean, Obama's constantly characterized as a pragmatist, and I think that's a good thing, that's a virtue. You don't want to be ideologically blinded, or blinded by your ideology. I'm generally an admirer of pragmatism, but it was pretty incoherent. Our foreign policy there was pretty incoherent. So Obama's been incoherent in that sense. As far as the Republicans are concerned, they don't know what to say. I mean, you know, they try to find, when Obama acts aggressively, which, like, getting rid of bin Laden, you'd think Republicans would like that, but they don't want to give Obama any credit, so they mumble, basically, when it comes to foreign policy. They try to sound hawkish, but they really don't. They're really isolationist. I think the isolationist strain is still very strong, and so they're hawkish isolationists, if that makes sense. And it actually does. There is a tradition like that.
Hi, I'm Felipe Zimmerlini. In regards to economic policy, that when we talk about it in foreign economic policy, and you take a look at programs such as NAFTA, how do you see them playing a role in the future of America as we continue to develop better foreign relations in economic perspectives? And do you see perhaps the way that we're going to be the right way, or is there a better path for us to be going towards either free trade or whatever other form of international economic policies?
I should just say that I don't, you know, you've had some economists talking with you, and you have an economist there. I don't claim to speak with any expertise about economics, and I'm not sure I can answer your question. You know, just my sense as a pure amateur here is that we've certainly learned that the global economies have become so interdependent that a crisis in Greece can have enormous implications on the housing market in Boston. And things like that. And so, you know, again, I'd be corrected by anyone who knows more than me. In economic policy, things happen. We're only reacting. In the foreign policy field that I'm talking about, I think we have more room to shape the world. I don't sense that we're shaping the world very much. We're reacting to forces. I shouldn't have said that, but now he's
No, I'm not. I'm gonna ask a question, and then we'll go back here. Let me take you out a little bit, Alan. And maybe I misunderstood you and I haven't read your whole book, but it sounded to me a little bit like what you're most concerned about is our rhetoric, the way we talk about our enemies. Let's say we change that. We no longer talked about, people like Hitler. How would that change the way we actually practice foreign policy? You said you supported us going into helping overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, I believe. What would be, again, role of government, what would be a set of principles from the point of view of political science that you would base a foreign policy on beyond, let's temper the rhetoric? What would be the kind of set of principles from which you were, let's say, Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, you would use to determine what the appropriate role of government is when it comes to Yugoslavia, when it comes to Libya, when it becomes Somalia, if it becomes, whatever?
Well, you're absolutely right. My book is about how we talk about foreign policy, and it's not a book about foreign policy. And I'm not I have suggestions in the book about how we ought to deal with situations like Rwanda and Darfur, or what mistakes we made, what we got right, what we got wrong. I analyze examples in the past of the deployment of force and try to say what we might have done better, or what we pretty much got right. But what should we do the next time around? That's a much more difficult question to answer. My point is that when we use the kind of rhetoric that I'm talking about, we forgo all kinds of options. We tie our hands. It's a way of imprisoning ourselves from having more flexible kinds of responses. And I think that's an important point to make. I think it's important, given A, that we're a democracy and rhetoric really means something, and B, that people come to believe their own rhetoric after a while. I mean, I have a section in there about former Vice President Cheney and all his talk about going over to the dark side. And what I find really interesting about that is, Cheney wanted to carry out all of these things on the dark side. If he had really been committed to the dark side, he never would have gone on Tim Russert show and announced that we were going. If you're really a Machiavellian, you just go over to the dark side. You don't brag about it. But it was essential for Cheney to brag about it, because his whole point was rhetorical. Cheney was the strongest advocate we have ever had of what could be called a rhetorical foreign policy. There's a brilliant book written about this that I cite. Cheney's idea was that if we really talk tough, our enemies will hear us talking tough and therefore back off. So rhetoric was essential to his whole concept. It wasn't just how he acted, but how he talked. So talking is really important, and that's why I think it's worth paying some attention to it. Now, what should we do in different kinds of situations? The only thing I can say to that is, if we get away from this rhetoric, I think we can take them all as they should be taken on a case-by-case basis. We can say, why do we have an interest here? In the case of Gaddafi, it's actually hard to say why we had an interest there, but the reason why I support it and defend it is I believe that the Arab Spring will have huge implications for the world in general, because it's such an important part of the world. That someone asked a question about the Middle East. I think we should be on the side of democratic movements in the Middle East. I think, the realists say, oh no, the Arab dictators may have been bad guys, but they kept stability, and we should always. I think that was wrong. So I think that's why I think it makes sense, even if it promotes a certain amount of instability, you can't be on the wrong side of democracy so often as we've been. So that's why I would joke, but that's how it would go on sort of a case by case.
So being on the right side of democracy would be one of your touchstones in terms
Again,
of
but not as an
policy.
inflexible principle. There are sometimes, it's very, very complicated when we said that we would support democracy within the Palestinian liberation movement, and as a result, Hamas won control of political power in the Gaza Strip. Supporting democracy can have unstable. So my point is, it's a general principle, but you shouldn't be blinded by any one particular principle you have to.
Thank you. And over here, and then we'll go over here. I'm sorry. Go and then right next to you, okay?
My name is Paul Tag, and I'm also an optimist like yourself. Our recent shifts in foreign policy have demonstrated, optimism reasons to be optimistic. And this is more of a comment to what Professor Blusen said. In terms of dialing down the rhetoric, if you look at the Arab Spring in Libya, we didn't have a bomb coming out denouncing Gaddafi necessarily as a leader, so we could be taken out in Bush kind of rhetoric or in that type of frame. And touching upon now what you mentioned earlier in soft power, we did see an example of the move from hard power to soft power, that he really brought NATO together. He brought people to the same table to get consensus that we need to use military power to remove Gaddafi, instead of it being kind of American presence, dictating our policy on Libya. It was more of a NATO presence and a global presence that he should be removed. And he kind of brought consensus together. So I think we can see the shift from what was in the Bush era. And again, Afghanistan was something that Bush kind of brought upon us and that Obama inherited. But Obama's first real test of foreign diplomacy was Afghanistan, or was Libya. I think we do see a pretty big fundamental shift in international diplomacy.
Thank you. Yes. You agree?
No, I agree.
No comment.
Well said.
My name's Richard Giordano. I've been attending this the first time this semester. I'm really enjoying it. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit and talk about what you think about whether or not America, the United States foreign policy, has contributed to some of the things that we've now gotten ourselves into. I think of, since World War II, all of the various supports of dictators throughout the world, or intervening after we don't like the dictators. We helped arm Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to get rid of the Russians, but then they turn on us. We don't like Noriega after years of liking him, and so we help to get him out. We don't like Allende. At some point we do the same around the Shah of Iran, where we created a dictatorship that ultimately leads to something else. So I'm just wondering, what is the United States' responsibility in creating the very problems that we then have to deal with afterwards?
Well, like the previous, that was a very good comment, and I agree with it. I think of all the examples you mentioned, all of which I think you're correct about, the one that really sticks out the most is Iran, where, Iran is a country that we should be allied with. It's a country of incredible, rich history and civilization and culture and beauty and democracy and all of these things. And by propping up the Shah and opposing a popular movement in Iran way back in the 1950s, we really set ourselves up for the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we're still living with that now. And I think it's one of the great tragedies, but actually I'm still hopeful on that one. I know a number of Iranians. I just feel that eventually there will be a popular movement that will. Just the other day, I run a center at Boston College, and we invite speakers. And our speaker yesterday, one of the best talks I ever heard, was by a man named Scott Peterson, who's the Christian Science Monitor's correspondent in that part of the world. He's no longer allowed in Iran. No Western correspondents are. He's based in Istanbul. But he gave an extraordinarily interesting talk about Iran, and he was very optimistic that there is an aura of inevitability about the Green Revolution there. And so I agree with a lot of what you said. Thank you.
Hi, Sharon Haidari. I'm from the Law and Public Policy program, and from one of the accessible people countries, from Iran actually. I also see a lot of shift in political rhetoric after actually George Bush's era, and when got to the Obama's era. So there are a lot of changes in political rhetoric, and that's when you said there is not that much difference between the two parties. I kind of disagree because I see a lot of changes in the language.
Okay. I'm not. I mean, there have been changes. I think with Obama, and I tried to say that. So again, I'm not in real disagreement with you on that.
Yes, I'm Melanie Burns. I would like to go back to the polarization again. Whether you see that as actually a policy as opposed to a disagreement about other kinds of policies, which is fundamentally just to freeze government, because at least at the far right, they don't believe in government, except, maybe build a bridge or a road once in a while. But whether there's any way to talk about that, to let the American people know that the things that they like about government, like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, are things that the Republican Party doesn't believe in, or at least the far right, to come back from the brink? Is there a way to engage the populace in that, to get to a conversation, so we might have some government here?
Thank you. I mean, as it happens, a recent book was just published directly on this question by a professor of political science at Cornell University named Suzanne Mettler. And she asked people, what does government do? And it's amazing how many people don't know what government does. The word government, I think we're really realizing when people say, I don't like government, they're talking about programs for poor people. That's what it means for them. They're not thinking about the things that government does for anyone else. That's what it means, and when they say they're against it, that's what they're against. If that would take tremendous leadership skills. It looks like Obama has really woken up in his last few weeks, and I think he's probably going to do a terrific sort of tutorial job on precisely that issue, because unless he does, he'll lose. And so it's a good question. I think that's what we're going to be focusing on. One other thing about your comment, a year or so ago, there was a debate among the liberal bloggers about whether or not the Republican Party was opposing everything, not just, as you say, out of a fear of government, but essentially to deliberately sabotage the economy, because then that would hurt Obama. I don't think there's any doubt. That sounded like a conspiracy idea from Noam Chomsky land out a year ago. Forgive me, he went to the same high school, I feel like but now it seems, yes, that looks like what they're doing. There's no other explanation for it.
My name is Helene there, and it's interesting that you were mentioning that it sounds like the Republican right does not believe in government, and yet that would mean that we do not believe in self-government, because that's the point of the Constitution was written for that. And I was interested because the topic of this discussion was supposed to be the role of government in the 21st century. So looking at what it's stated to be, the role of government in the Constitution, is to establish a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, we're good on the common defense. That seems to be well, in our focus. I'm not exactly sure what the interpretation is of different sides on liberty. And what I think I would like to hear a discussion of how does government establish justice, and what does it mean to ensure domestic tranquility? That's a really interesting phrase. And then my favorite has always been promote the general welfare, which is certainly one that we don't hear anywhere near enough about. So it strikes me that there's a kind of a wrestling match going on between some of these and some of the others, like the liberty versus the general welfare. So how do you interpret the general welfare and domestic tranquility, and if you care to discuss justice, that would be great too.
I always like reading scripture in class.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure glad they put that word welfare in there. I mean, government, domestic tranquility, keeping the peace has always been a function of government. And again, you know, we can talk about what people mean by government and so on. And it is, again, interesting to me that, you know, in years I can remember when I was a lot younger, especially during the Nixon years, one of the things the Republican Party stood for was very strong support for the police and an anti-crime program and so on. But if any of the Republican budgets were ever to be passed, police departments would just be slacked. We'd lose incredible, you know, support for those agencies that promote domestic tranquility. But the general welfare, I think, is a term for the common good. The people who wrote our Constitution, this was the lecture I was originally supposed to give, were very strong believers in the idea that you couldn't just trust all individuals to pursue their own self-interest without some sense of the common good. Some of them, like Madison, believed that people would check each other's interests and the common good might emerge as a kind of byproduct, an indirect byproduct, but all of them believed to one degree or another in the idea of a public. There's some people on the right who love to say, you know, this isn't a democracy, this is a republic, and they mean by that a republic is a much more right-wing idea than a democracy. They don't know the history. The idea of a republic is a very radical idea. It comes from the Latin res publica. I mean, things held in common. And it really refers directly to the idea of the general welfare that you're talking about. So thank you for reading from the Constitution. We have one last one? Or one more?
Yeah, one more.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Willette. So I was really struck by the fact that you spoke about other countries that have experienced terrorism and how their leaders don't use that sweeping political evil rhetoric that your book is about. So why is America so different? Is it because of our individualism? Is it because of our Puritan, basis? Is it because of the success that our former leaders have had using this kind of rhetoric? What do you think about that?
Well, it's a good question. There are other countries that do use the same kind of rhetoric. Someone mentioned the Middle East, and the current leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, happens to be an author, and he's written 2 books on terrorism. And he pretty much uses the same kind of rhetoric. So we're not alone. With respect to us, it probably ultimately comes down to the fact that we emerged as a world power very, very late. A lot of people said that, what was really striking about September 11th was that in other parts of the world, the things that happened on that day to us were certainly by no means routine. But if you live in a number of European countries, Belgium, France, Germany, you know about death and you know about people dying in war. And so I think it's the flip side of our innocence. And if you want to say that there's a good side to it, you could say our fascination with the language of evil is a reflection of our equally fascination with the idea of good, that we're good people, that we're an innocent people, a special people, exempt from the rules of history and so on.
We have time maybe for a few more questions, and then we're going to let you out a little earlier tonight. We'll go hear the Red Sox.
My name is Justin. I'm a graduate student here. Question about some of the recent rhetoric in the Republican debates. I'm wondering whether you think that the shift away from a more interventionist approach, even Rick Perry was saying that we needed to reduce our presence in Afghanistan, is a sincere shift towards their more isolationist roots, or are they just responding to the overwhelming public opinion of a decade of war that everybody, even on the conservative side, is sick of? So I'm wondering whether you think it's more political or whether the party is actually maybe returning towards its isolationist roots.
I think the latter. I think the default position for the Republican Party is really isolationist. I think in the history of the past century, it's really been the Democratic Party that's been the party of the military and the party have overseas activity. Robert Dole once said, he was sort of booed down by saying the Democrats were a war party, but he's kind of right about that. The real place where most Republicans feel comfortable is with isolationism. Now, what happened is interesting. In the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, a group of former Democrats became very influential in the Republican Party. They were called the Neoconservatives. They were not only former Democrats, they were former Marxists and Trotskyites. And they had a huge influence on the Republican Party, but there was always something not quite comfortable for a lot of Republicans about being advised by, frankly, Jewish, urbane, sophisticated intellectuals. It's pretty clear now that the neocons have essentially been thrown out. People like Rick Perry. Rick Perry will have nothing to do with them. They're looking for someone. They had McCain's ear, but McCain is nowhere to be found this time around. It was Bill Kristol, one of the neoconservatives, who discovered Sarah Palin, because the neoconservative idea always was, and this grows directly out of their reading of Leo Strauss, a prominent political philosopher, that you get a dumb leader so that you can really influence that leader with your ideas. And really, I'm serious. That was very much part of it. But that kind of exploded in their face. So, I think a lot of I have friends who are neoconservatives. My colleagues in my department at Boston College are almost all Straussian political philosophers and neoconservatives, and they're all going to vote for Obama. They really don't feel that vision that they are of a more aggressive interventionist program. They've got a better chance these days with Democrats than with Republicans.
One last question. Here we go.
I'm
Who are
curious
you?
about, my name is Kathy Jacob.
Thanks, Kathy.
You talked about not having, people not having an idea of foreign policy except maybe about defense because they can understand war and you have to defend yourself. But after that, it's kind of, they don't know. Like you said, with the domestic policy, people don't really understand what the role of government is. I think it's even more so with foreign policy. But foreign policy is ever so much more complicated than having somebody talk to somebody about some kind of trade agreement or something. There's an element in the room, an elephant in the room that we don't ever talk about. And it's the diminished role of government in the face of corporations and in the face of whoever is doing the dread wars on our borders, and who's benefiting from that kind of activity. If the American people don't seem to be, and who can control it? Because we don't seem to be controlling it.
Well,
It's all extreme rhetoric.
Yeah, it's a big element, but maybe I'm wrong. I've just assumed you've talked about that in other ones of your sessions, and I wanted to put the focus a little bit differently on foreign policy tonight. But yes, we'd have to have a whole other session about the really dramatic change. I talked about the dramatic political changes, but the changes in income distribution, the changes in corporate power, the consequences of the Citizens United decision, which created a flood of spending by corporations and not by labor unions, those are having dramatic impacts. They just weren't the focus tonight.
Well, I want to thank Professor Wolfe for a fascinating evening. I wanted this to be about the role of government, and it really was. Because what we're talking about here is, when should government do X in foreign policy or domestic policy? And how should it do it? And indeed, Alan was exactly right. We're not going to touch upon this, I don't think, for the rest of the semester. Next week, we're going to take a look at income and wealth inequality. And the week after that, just to give you a little bit more preview of coming attractions, we're going to be looking at a very fundamental argument behind all of this, which is, when should we do something through the market, through the private sector, and when should we do something as a matter of a right, usually through government. That should be a particularly interesting evening, because I've invited my friend Jim Sturgios, who is the head of the Pioneer Institute, a very conservative think tank, In fact, Jim just invited, of all the candidates he could have invited to Massachusetts, he invited Rick Perry, who was here last week. And we're going to be debating or discussing, dialoguing, without some of the rhetoric that we see in our foreign policy, about those questions. The following week, I'm going to do something I have never done in the open classroom, although I've done it several thousand times in the 40 years I've been teaching. I am your speaker. And I am going to be looking at two really iconic economists, both of whom died very recently. Milton Friedman, the conservative Chicago Milton Friedman, and Ken Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard University. Two men who actually looked very different. One was short and looked like me, and the other was 6'11". They had very different positions on exactly this issue of the role of government. And I'm going to be playing both roles. I'm going to play Milton Friedman. That's easy, at least in terms of not having to put on a lot of makeup. And I'm going to play Ken Galbraith, and we're going to play them off against each other. And then, following that, is when we really get into the meat, and we start looking at the role of government in X. And we have a fascinating array of people speaking, including our own Nani Burns on regulation of insurance, Eric Rosengren from the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, President and CEO on the regulation of financial institutions, John Quokka from our economics department on the regulation of non-financial corporations, very much having to do with things like the auto industry. We have Charlie Kravitz, who is the CEO of WBUR, now running a major fundraising campaign about the role of government in public radio, as well as someone who is returning to the open classroom. We had so much fun with him last time, Spiro Valudis, who is the artistic director of the Lyric Stage, which gets money from the Massachusetts Council on Humanities. And we'll also have a gentleman, Mr. Liokos, from the Massachusetts Cultural Center. So we've got a lot of good stuff coming up. Come back often. We'll see you next Wednesday night. Again, Happy New Year to those of the Jewish faith, and go Red Sox.